Thank you, Raheem, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, if we look at the timeline, George Floyd was killed on May 25th. Within a couple of days, peaceful protests were turned into national riots. So do you think this is a natural development, or do you feel this is made to happen?
Well, I think there is this attitude, especially on the hard political left, which has never really gone away, at least in the last 50 or 60 years in the Western world. The same sort of actors, the same sort of influencers on the political left always see a crisis as a means by which to exploit certain feelings, certain emotions for their own ideological gains. In this instance, it's the killing, the murder of George Floyd, but in previous iterations, it's been globalist summits, the G20 summits, it's been financial crashes and collapses we saw with the Occupy protests. And we also have seen it happen at a much smaller and local level as well. I have to say that when the whole thing first began, I could read the ruins and see that this would probably turn into something obviously much more widespread, and that feeling would be transfigured by some bad actors into mass rioting that we're seeing today. So I think for most people in this space who have read into these things for a long time, it was eminently predictable. I think the thing that's caught some people off guard is the extreme elements of it, how much it's brought so many cities to a grinding halt, and how long this has now been going on for.
Mm-hmm. Who are those protesters?
Well, there are a lot of legitimate, angry protesters who are, for the most part, peacefully letting their feelings known about what they think the inconsistencies are in policing across the United States, the grievance factors that many communities may or may not have. But there is a significant and growing, and if not by now, a majority portion of a lot of these protests that are springing up all around the country, which are being driven by people, A, who are not even stakeholders in any of those grievances, but B, people who would quite happily see young black men and women hauled off to prison for rioting or looting, being caught up in the action, because they don't actually see their cause as the same. They see sort of the Black Lives Matter and justice for George Floyd causes as a conduit by which this other group can glob on their aspirations and their ideological aims onto legitimate protests. And you can see that more and more as time passes. There are telltale signs just by going around and looking at a lot of the damage and graffiti that's been put up in the last couple of days. There is as much anarchistic, anti-capitalistic, communistic propaganda that is being daubed across public buildings and private businesses as there is justice for George Floyd stuff. So at this point in time, and from really this weekend, this past weekend onward, we've seen it either become a 50-50 situation, or indeed the Antifa elements becoming a majority.
Mm-hmm. So talking about Antifa, what is Antifa and what does it stand for exactly?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. There doesn't seem to be an agreement over the definition of this thing now, but as somebody who has dealt with the far left and Antifa for over a decade now, the general reading of Antifa within level-headed circles is that it is a far left group, a non liberal left group. This is a loose organization and affiliation. There isn't really a command and control structure to Antifa as we would typically understand it, as in, a big leader at the top barking orders down. It's more of a flat leadership situation where everybody has a stake in deciding how things take place within Antifa groups. And what they particularly stand for, as far as I'm concerned, is this kind of relitigation of the Spanish Civil War. They see everything through the prism of fascist versus anti-fascist, or as if we are being more historically correct about who the quote-unquote anti-fascists have historically been, it's communists. So they see it as two extremes facing off against each other, and they very much view police or whatever other authorities happen to be in charge in the day as the fascists. This didn't change because Barack Obama was a left-wing progressive president. It was the very same under him as it is under President Trump. So they kind of don't distinguish between leaders of a state at any one time. For them, it's the system that is wrong. And again, you see that being portrayed often when you go to these protesters. They don't even necessarily name people like President Trump, for instance, but what they will say is things like capitalism is murder, bring the system down. Antifa is an international loose affiliation as well. It's really an ideology in and of itself at the same time as being this gang, or as the president I know in the United States wants to designate it, a terror group.
I don't know if you are aware of this, but one of Antifa's founders were trained by this other group called Weather Underground, whose leader had very close ties with the Chinese Communist Party. Another question I want to ask you is, who is funding Antifa?
Well, that's a question I think that nobody quite has a specific answer to, in the sense that there are no sort of receipts lying around or invoices that have been published, because they don't incorporate under any one banner. There's no accounting to go through. There's not even really anybody for the federal government to necessarily audit. But what's very clear, especially in this last round of riots that we've seen here in the United States, is that there's an organization to it that requires a level of funding to be going into it. Now, a lot of people will happily speculate as to where that money is coming from. I think it's more incumbent upon us to investigate before reporting on any conclusions in that regard. But the same names often come back time after time. People suspect that the Open Society Foundations, which was founded and is run by George Soros, is involved at some level. But also, I think people forget that actually a lot of these organizations and institutions have received government funding over the years. Because they don't go under any one particular name or organization, it's very easy for these guys to set up a different splinter group, an activist group, a group that looks like a harmless NGO, and actually apply for funding both from local and national governments. In the United Kingdom, where I'm from, we've seen, at least over the last couple of decades, groups that are overtly and openly linked in often cases with Antifa and the black bloc elements that you see smashing window fronts up. They have actually been on the receiving end of government grants, of taxpayer money. And they do this under the auspices of saying, well, we have people in the community, we run this program, we run this extracurricular activity, and of course the predominantly left-wing paper pushers inside Western governments are quite happy to sign over checks by at the same time doing the least amount of investigation and effort into who they're signing taxpayer money over to.
That's incredible. For this particular protest, protests turn into riots. How big of a presence does Antifa have? Well,
I do think, as I say, that at the outset, outset, you saw a much more organic and really truly emotional protest from ordinary people all across the United States, predominantly people from black communities across the United States who are coming out really to grieve. And then very quickly after that, an opportunity arose for Antifa to get their foot in the door, as it were, on the cause. And over the last couple of days, I would have estimated that at least 50% of the protests that we've seen, of the people at the protests that we've seen, in some way, shape or form, have nothing to do with the original grievance here, and legitimate grievance it is, but are more interested in an ideological fight, are more interested in sparking a race war as a means by which to replace Donald Trump as president. But you also have to remember that a lot of these people wouldn't be that much more happy, if any more happy at all, if the president was Joe Biden. They are much more inclined to vote for somebody like Bernie Sanders. A lot of them think Bernie Sanders is even too far for them. We have to bear in mind this: the original protests that took place after President Trump's election were actually planned before the election. They had already decided that no matter who is elected, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, they were going to riot in the streets anyway. It just so happened that President Trump was elected, but it would have happened under Clinton too, and therefore I believe these sorts of things, as we're seeing now, would also happen under Joe Biden. This is not just about a small change these people are looking to make. They're fighting a longer war to shift the entire country and its culture to the far left, and therefore they hope in due course that will lead to somebody a lot more like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or somebody even further to the left, becoming the flavor of the week politically.
What's their end goal? Do they want to destroy America?
Well, a lot of them actually, funnily enough, think of themselves as patriots. There is a show that is quite popular here in the United States at the moment about a conservative activist called Phyllis Schlafly. The show's done incredibly well on Hulu, and a certain scene stood out to me whereby the leftist person on screen at the point in time was being challenged on their views, and they were told, hey, listen, I can't believe in what you believe in, I'm a patriot. And she replies, exactly. And they do believe that America has gone too far in terms of being a capitalist or free market driven economy. They believe in more communistic values. They believe in much more hardline redistribution of wealth. They don't believe in freedom of speech. They don't believe that people's views, if they are not the views of them, their ideological perspective, should be able to be aired. And they believe in the rewriting of history. I mean, there's a reason that George Orwell wrote about the memory holes in 1984. There's a reason that the Spanish Civil War impacted him enough to be able to write something like Animal Farm, and compare and contrast the deviations between different leftist mantras here. But if you were to ask them, write down on a piece of paper what you actually want, predominantly they wouldn't be able to come up with a long-form manifesto. It would be something more like, overthrow the system. It's the system they have a problem with, not necessarily the politicians.
Okay, talking about that, I mean, the American media's reaction to Antifa is I think their attitude is very lenient. Just a few days ago, Antifa sent out a tweet. I think it's on May 31st. And that tweet says, "Tonight is the night, comrade. Tonight we say, F the city. We move into the residential areas, the white hoods, and we take what's ours." Right now, this account is suspended by Twitter, but other Antifa Twitter accounts are still active. Also, a CNN criticized President Trump for designating Antifa as a terror group, saying Antifa is only a left-leaning non-organization. It's, implying like no harm to anybody. What is going on with the media? Why are they so lenient on organizations like Antifa?
Well, from the outset, you have to appreciate that a lot of the media in the Western world, they all went to sort of the same universities, studied the same courses, did masters in journalism at liberal left universities across the country, and they're professors were the 60s, the soissons huitards, the 68ers, the radicals. They were people who were brought up on Theodore Adorno and Marx and others, and Alinsky, and they truly have been brought up to believe that there is actually nothing incorrect about the far left position, but that more it's about the means by which you impact wholesale societal, cultural, and governmental change. And they have decided in the mainstream media that it's their job to go about it through implementing cultural Marxism at a more establishment level, but they don't actually have any fundamental differences with the mindset of Antifa. They believe that the United States is built on a racist premise. They believe that $15 trillion in reparations are due to black people. They believe that the system of capitalism necessarily discriminates in a non-positive way against minorities, and so they have this sort of white cultural guilt combined with their 60s radical professorial intake of understanding that leads them to this position. But in a way of sort of saying it in a much more simpler way, they go to the same parties. They attend the same book launches. They go to the same baristas. They mix in with each other quite well. And we saw that again during the Occupy protests. Mainstream media did not want to confront what was really happening in those Occupy camps all across the Western world, quite frankly. And you're seeing the same thing here now. Finally, on that, what I would say is for the ones that not openly in bed or covertly in bed, either one, with Antifa, there is a major lack of understanding. There is a major lack of reading, firstly in terms of classical reading and historical reading from recent history. And they don't really understand the factors at play. They don't understand America's contribution to the world. They don't understand America's history. They don't understand why it's important to guard against Marxism and Marxist intrusions, and they really do believe that the Cold War was over and that we no longer have to worry about radical leftism. Well, radical leftism is far worse in this country today than it was during the Cold War. And you only have to look at the corporate culture in the United States to realize that actually, Marxism has mainstreamed itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I don't know if you agree with me. Do you see a trend? I mean, these protests turn into riots. I mean, now it's, the time it takes to turn into like big riots and bigger riots is becoming shorter and shorter in the US. So I was wondering if this is going to become a new norm. Any type of those protests will be hijacked and be turned into national riots.
Yeah, and you actually do see a lot of ire from within black communities people are very upset about their legitimate issues being hijacked. You're seeing videos from all around the country of people confronting Antifa within their ranks, telling people to go away if they're, bringing bricks and delivering bricks and trying to implicate black men and women in the advances of Antifa into businesses, into different cities all across the country. But I wouldn't say I would expect it to become the new normal. These things have an exhaustion period, and they have an exhaustion period because there isn't limitless cash that goes to these things. The public appetite for these things also wanes very quickly as people become dissatisfied about not being able to live their lives normally. They may be able to get away with a little bit more this time because people have been used to these lockdowns because of the coronavirus pandemic for so many months. So it doesn't even necessarily feel out of the norm to have to stay indoors or even have a curfew in the Western world right now. But again, I think they sense when the mood sways against them and there will be a necessary retreat as a result. What they simply hope, however, is that they can glean enough followers as a result of this new thing to fuel them for the next round.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about President Trump. Trump announced on Monday that he is ready to deploy the military to enforce order if state and city leaders refuse to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents. So do you think we have reached a point where military is necessary?
Well, it'll differ on a case by case, on a state by state, on a city by city basis. But the further action taken on Monday night in Washington D.C., bringing the curfew 4 hours forward into the evening, making sure that there was air support for the police up there, making sure that there were horses available to push back protesters, pushing people out of Lafayette Park early on in the evening, and actually arresting people who were breaking the curfew seems to have done a much better job of stopping late night looting and rioting as we had seen over the course of the weekend. Now, contrast that with somewhere like New York City, where they didn't actually have more strict measures, then yes, President Trump may well be looking at New York and thinking to himself, well, if the mayor isn't willing to do anything and the governor isn't willing to do anything, then the federal government will have to step in. This is, after all, a country. It is obviously within the first. It should be within the first instincts of a governor to do that job. But if the country is being harmed in some way, then I believe that the president will be able to find a legal prerogative, not least because of the excellent Attorney General Bill Barr being at his side through all of this, to find a way to be able to send the military in and deal with the situation. However, I will say this, even political Democrats like Andrew Cuomo will realize very quickly that he won't get reelected if he allows this to continue, where Macy's is being looted long into the night and Fifth Avenue is trashed and boarded up. So I suspect that we'll see a bit more of a crackdown, even in the more reluctant places, from more squishy politicians.
Okay. Very good. So these are all my questions. Do you have anything else to add?
Well, I would just say that in terms of Antifa, the argument that this is simply a domestic organization is not true at all. This is an international institution, an ideology that spans the Western world. It has deeply entrenched in Europe. There are deep ties between Antifa in the United States and Antifa in Europe, and the president should play heavily on that if he wants to make the case that they should be designated as a terror organization, because the legal minds and the media minds that are trying to drum up antipathy towards Antifa and have the president's recommendations laughed at in the court of public opinion, they're going to make the case that this is a domestic organization or ideology, and therefore it's not legal for the president to crack down like this. The truth is, Antifa are quite openly, multinationally, and should be dealt with as a multinational organization and ideology.
Right. All right. Thank you very much, Raheem. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.